Hey y'all, this is Radical Reads. Today I'm going to be reading Zionist Colonialism, written by Fayez A. Sayegh in 1965 and published under the Palestine Liberation Organization's Palestine Research Center. The Palestine Research Center was a research institution established by the Palestine Liberation Organization in Beirut, Lebanon in 1965. It gathered, conserved, documented, and analyzed materials on Palestinian culture, liberation, resistance, and history. During the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, members of the PLO anticipated attacks on the research center and packed a collection of rare archival documents and highly sensitive information in 2 suitcases and shipped them out of Lebanon for protection. Those members of the PLO were correct to do so, as in September 1982, during the Zionist invasion of Beirut, the building was occupied by Israeli occupation forces for a week, where it was ransacked. The Zionist state to this day brags about this theft and currently holds these collections hostage in occupied Jaffa, also known as Tel Aviv. In 1983, the building was ultimately destroyed in a car bombing done by an Israeli-created and financed proxy terrorist group called the Front for the Liberation of Lebanon from Foreigners. The bombing killed 6 people and destroyed any remaining materials left after the Israeli occupation forces raid. The targeting of a hub for Palestinian history and culture teaches us 2 things. 1, the Zionist occupation is brutally committed to erasing Palestine and Palestinian people. And 2, the importance of documenting and analyzing our history, culture, and resistance. Members of the PLO risked their lives every day to resist Zionist violence, and education was a massive part of this. The barest minimum that we owe them is to read and learn to combat the propaganda Zionism shoves down our throats. On the left is a picture of the research center building in Beirut, Lebanon. The building was 6 stories high. And on the right is pictures of the ransacked shelves inside of the building after the IOF's occupation and theft. Let's talk about Fayez A. Sayegh, the author of today's reading. Sayegh was born to a Palestinian Syrian family in Syria. His father was a Presbyterian minister. The family moved to Tiberias, Palestine, or Dabariya in Arabic, when he was very young. He studied at the American University of Beirut for his bachelor's and master's, then received his PhD from Georgetown University in philosophy with a minor in political science. Fayez Sayegh was the first director of the PLO's Palestine Research Center, and some of his most notable contributions include establishing the Palestinian Affairs Academic Journal in 1971 and being a main contributor to the UN Resolution 3379, passed in 1975, which labeled Zionism as a form of racism. Due to Israeli and American pressures and threats, that resolution would be revoked in 1991. And here's a couple pictures of Fayez A. Sayegh, who died in New York City in 1980. Zionist Colonialism is one of his most celebrated works, and it features an analysis of the Zionist ideology as well as the establishment of the Zionist state. He identifies key characteristics of Zionism that distinguishes it from European colonialism. These characteristics include racial self-segregation and a commitment to racial purity, state territorial expansion, and an unbending commitment to violence. Fayez also writes on the Palestinian response and opposition to Zionist colonialism from the first and second waves of Zionism up until the creation of the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1964. I'm really excited to be reading this fantastic and concise text analyzing the unique features of Zionist colonialism, and I'm happy you're here listening. You can find a link to the PDF in the description below. And let me know what you think of this little discussion section. I might add reflection questions or talk a little bit about what made me pick this text over others. I'm not sure. I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do here, but I think some context and historical background is important and will definitely stay a part of future videos. I'd be super appreciative of any feedback or suggestions. Be sure to check out my other videos and like, subscribe, share, and leave a comment. I'm always super interested in hearing y'all's thoughts and opinions about the texts I read, even if you disagree with them. I made an Instagram for this channel, also not sure what I'm gonna do with it. Currently has one post, but I'll figure it out. If you have any questions or comments about the text, or just want to discuss anything political or have any other inquiries, feel free to follow me on Instagram at radicalreads1312 and send me a DM, or email me at radicalreads1312@gmail.com. And you can buy me a coffee at the link shown on your screen if you'd like to show a little extra love and support. Always appreciated, never necessary. Okay, thank you all for being here, and let's get started. Zionist Colonialism in Palestine, written by Fayez A. Sayegh in 1965 for the Research Center of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Forward. The past 2 decades, which have witnessed the collapse of European imperialism and the progressive elimination of Western colonialism from Asia and Africa, have witnessed also the introduction of a new form of colonialism into the point of intersection of those 2 continents. Thus, the fading out of a cruel and shameful period of world history has coincided with the emergence, at the land bridge between Asia and Africa, of a new offshoot of European imperialism and a new variety of racist colonialism. The fate of Palestine thus represents an anomaly, a radical departure from the trend of contemporary world history. Scores of nations and peoples have come to enjoy their right to self-determination at the very same time when the Arab people of Palestine was finding itself helpless to prevent the culmination of a process of systematic colonization to which it had been subjected for decades. This climactic development took the combined form of forcible dispossession of the indigenous population, their expulsion from their own country, the implantation of an alien sovereignty on their soil, and the speedy importation of hordes of aliens to occupy the land, thus emptied of its rightful inhabitants. The people of Palestine have lost not only political control over their country, but physical occupation of their country as well. They have been deprived not only of their inalienable right to self-determination, but also of their elemental right to exist on their own land. This dual tragedy, which befell the Arab people of Palestine in the middle of the 20th century, symbolizes the dual nature of the Zionist program, which had begun to unfold itself in Palestine in the late 19th century. 1. The historical setting of Zionist colonialism. The frenzied scramble for Africa of the 1880s stimulated the beginnings of Zionist colonization in Palestine. As European fortune hunters, prospective settlers, and empire builders raced for Africa, Zionist settlers and would-be state builders rushed for Palestine. Under the influence of the credo of nationalism, then sweeping across Europe, some Jews had come to believe that the religious and alleged racial bonds among Jews constituted a Jewish nationality and endowed the so-called Jewish nation with normal national rights, including the right to separate existence in a territory of its own and the right to create a Jewish state. If other European nations had successfully extended themselves into Asia and Africa and had annexed to their imperial domains vast portions of those 2 continents, the Jewish nation, it was argued, was entitled and able to do the same thing for itself. By imitating the colonial ventures of the Gentile nations, among whom Jews lived, the Jewish nation could send its own colonists into a piece of Afro-Asian territory, establish a settler community, and, in due course, set up its own state. Not, indeed, as an imperial outpost of a metropolitan home base, but as a home base in its own right, upon which the entire Jewish nation would sooner or later converge from all over the world. Jewish nationalism would thus fulfill itself through the process of colonization, which other European nations had utilized for empire building. For Zionism, then, colonization would be the instrument of nation building, not the byproduct of already fulfilled nationalism. The improvised process of Jewish colonization in Palestine which ensued was hardly a spectacular success, in spite of lavish financial subsidies from European Jewish financiers. By and large, Jews were more attracted by the new opportunities for migration to the United States or Argentina than by the call for racial self-segregation as a prelude to state building in Palestine. The objective of escape from anti-Jewish practices prevailing in some European societies could be attained just as well by emigration to America. The objective of nation building, which alone could make the alternative solution of large-scale colonization in Palestine more attractive, was still far from widespread among European Jews in the late 19th century. The failure of the first sporadic effort to implant a Zionist settler community in Palestine during the first 15 years of Zionist colonization from 1882 to 1897 prompted serious reappraisal and a radical revision of strategy. This was accomplished by the first Zionist Congress held at Bâle in August 1897 under the leadership of Theodor Herzl. Haphazard colonization of Palestine, supported by wealthy Jewish financiers as a mixed philanthropic colonial venture, was from then on to be eschewed. It was to be supplanted by a purely nationalistic program of organized colonization with clear political goals and mass support. Hence, the overall objective of Zionism formulated by the Bâle Congress. The aim of Zionism is to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine secured by public law. It is worth noting that from the Bâle program of 1897 until the Biltmore program of 1942, Zionists preferred the euphemism home to the clear term state, which would have been certain to arouse opposition in many quarters. But in spite of public assurances to the contrary, Zionists were aiming from the outset at the creation of a settler state in Palestine. At the conclusion of the Bâle Congress, Herzl wrote in his diary, "If I were to sum up the Bâle Congress in one word, which I shall not do openly, it would be this: at Bâle I founded the Jewish state. If I were to say this today, I would be met by universal laughter. In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50, everyone will see it." In addition to defining the ultimate objective of Zionism, the Bâle Congress made a diagnosis of the special character and circumstances of Zionist colonization in Palestine and formulated a practical program suited to those special conditions. 3 essential features in particular differentiated Zionist colonization in Palestine from European colonization elsewhere in Asia and Africa and called for Zionist innovations. 1. Other European settlers who had gone or were then going to other parts of Africa and Asia had been animated either by economic or by politico-imperialist motives. They had gone either in order to accumulate fortunes by means of privileged and protected exploitation of immense natural resources, or in order to prepare the ground for, or else aid and abet, the annexation of those coveted territories by imperial European governments. The Zionist colonists, on the other hand, were animated by neither impulse. They were driven to the colonization of Palestine by the desire to attain nationhood for themselves and to establish a Jewish state which would be independent of any existing government and subordinate to none, and which would in due course attract to its territories the Jews of the world. 2. Other European settlers could coexist with the indigenous populations, whom they would exploit and dominate, but whose services they would nevertheless require, and whose continued existence in the coveted territory they would therefore tolerate. But the Zionist settlers could not countenance indefinite coexistence with the inhabitants of Palestine, for Palestine was fully populated by Arabs, whose national consciousness had already been awakened, and who had already begun to nurse aspirations of independence and national fulfillment. Zionist colonization could not possibly assume the physical proportion envisaged by Zionism while the Arab people of Palestine continued to inhabit its homeland. Nor could the Zionist political aspirations of racial self-segregation and statehood be accomplished while the nationally conscious Arab people of Palestine continued to exist in that country. Unlike European colonization elsewhere, therefore, Zionist colonization of Palestine was essentially incompatible with the continued existence of the native population in the coveted country. 3. Other European settlers could, without much difficulty, overcome the obstacles obstructing their settlement in the chosen target territories. They could count on receiving adequate protection from their imperial sponsors. But the prospective Zionist colonizers of Palestine could count on no such facilities. For, in addition to the Arab people of Palestine, certain to resist any large-scale influx of settlers loudly proclaiming their objective of dispossessing the natives, the Zionists were likely to encounter also the resistance of the Ottoman authorities, who could not view with favor the establishment on an important segment of their empire of an alien community harboring political designs of independent statehood. It was in order to counteract these peculiar factors of its situation that the Zionist movement, while defining its ultimate objective at the First Zionist Congress, proceeded to formulate an appropriate practical program as well. This program called for action along 3 lines: organization, colonization, and negotiation. Number 1. The organizational efforts were given supreme priority. For, lacking a state structure and a home base of its own to mastermind and supervise the process of overseas colonization, the Zionist movement required a quasi-state apparatus to perform those functions. The World Zionist Organization, with its federations of local societies, its Congress, its General Council, and its central executive, was established at Bal in order to play that role. Number 2. The instruments of systematic colonization were also promptly readied. The Jewish Colonial Trust of 1898, the Colonization Commission of 1898, the Jewish National Fund of 1901, the Palestine Office of 1908, and the Palestine Land Development Company of 1908 were among the first institutions established by the Zionist organization. Their joint purpose was to plan, finance, and supervise the process of colonization, and to ensure that it would not meet the same fate which the earlier experiment of haphazard colonization had met. Number 3. While the instruments of colonization were being laboriously created, diplomatic efforts were also being exerted to produce political conditions that would permit, facilitate, and protect large-scale colonization. At the beginning, these efforts were focused mainly on the Ottoman Empire, then in control of the political fortunes of Palestine. Direct approaches to the Ottoman authorities were made, lucrative promises of financial grants and loans were dangled before the eyes of the Sultan, and European powers were urged to intercede at port on behalf of the Zionist organization in order to persuade the Sultan to grant the organization a charter for an autonomous Zionist settlement in Palestine. Other efforts were exerted to induce the German emperor to endorse the creation of a chartered land development company which would be operated by Zionists in Palestine under German protection. Still, other attempts were made to obtain permission from the British government to establish an autonomous Zionist settlement in the Sinai Peninsula as a stepping stone towards colonization in Palestine. But none of these efforts bore fruit. By the end of the first decade following the inauguration of the new Zionist movement in 1897, Zionism had made little progress towards putting its elaborate colonization apparatus to work, and had scored even less success in its political efforts to obtain governmental permission and facilities for colonization in Palestine. Its hopes for de jure colonization shattered, Zionism shifted its strategy once more and turned to de facto colonization, hoping to gain thereby some political leverage which would serve it in good stead when the time came for renewal of its attempts to secure political recognition. In 1907 and 1908, therefore, a new phase of Zionist colonization was inaugurated without prior legalization or sponsorship by a European power. It was more consciously nationalistic in impulse, more militantly segregationist in its attitude towards the Palestinian Arabs, and more concerned with strategic and political considerations in its selection of locations for its new settlements. But, for all its enhanced dynamism and sharpened ideological consciousness, the second wave of Zionist colonization was not appreciably more successful than the first, as far as its magnitude was concerned. By the outbreak of the First World War, therefore, the Zionist colonization of Palestine had met with only modest success in over 30 years of action. In the first place, Zionists were still an infinitesimal minority of about 1% of the Jews of the world. Their activities had aroused the fear and opposition of the other Jews who sought in the solution of the Jewish problem in assimilation in Western Europe and the United States, not in self-segregation in Palestine. In the second place, Zionist colonization had proceeded very slowly. After 30 years of immigration to Palestine, Jews were still under 8% of the total population of the country, in possession of no more than 2.5% of the land. And in the third place, Zionism had failed to obtain political endorsement from the Ottoman authorities controlling Palestine, or from any European power. The war, however, created new circumstances which were destined to improve considerably the fortunes of Zionist colonization in Palestine. For the war set the stage for an alliance concluded in 1917 between British imperialism and Zionist colonialism, which, during the following 30 years, opened the gates of Palestine to Zionist colonizers, facilitated the establishment of Zionist settler community, and paved the way for the dispossession and expulsion of the Arab people in Palestine and the creation of the Zionist settler state in 1948. Whereas unilateral Zionist colonization failed in the 30 years preceding the First World War to make much headway, the alliance of Zionist colonialism and British imperialism succeeded, during the 30 years following the First World War in accomplishing the objectives of both parties. 2. The alliance of British imperialism and Zionist colonialism. Until the First World War, Britain's policy in the Middle East had revolved around the maintenance of the integrity of the Ottoman Empire in Asia. The European domains of the empire had been emancipated from Ottoman domination, and the North African domains had been annexed by various European powers long before the war. But the Asian domains had been insulated in the meantime from the imperial rivalries of the European powers. Britain's imperial interests in the area, namely control over the Suez Canal and immunization of the region from rival European domination over the overland route to India, were better served by a tractable Ottoman Empire than they would have been by a European scramble for the Middle East, which might have brought one or another of Britain's European rivals to the vicinity of the canal, or athwart the overland route. When Turkey joined the Central Powers in the war, however, the premises of Britain's imperial policy for the Middle East were shattered overnight. Alternative policies for the post-war period had to be made. At first, Britain envisaged a new order for the Middle East, in which Arab autonomy would supplant Ottoman imperial rule in Southwest Asia. Anglo-Arab agreements to that effect concluded in the fall of 1915, led to the Arab revolt against Turkey in 1916. But the pressures of other European powers, then wartime allies of Britain, precluded sole British overlordship. Secret agreements were therefore reached in the spring of 1916 between Britain, France, and Tsarist Russia for division of the Ottoman spoils. And as British feelings of security, predicated on the belief in the impenetrability of the Sinai Peninsula, had been destroyed by recent wartime experiences, it came to be felt that not only Sinai, but also Palestine, must be made safe in order that the canal might be rendered secure. The 1916 Anglo-French agreement providing for the internationalization of most of Palestine came therefore to be viewed with alarm by empire-minded British statesmen, and the staking of French claims to the entirety of Palestine could hardly have served to allay the aroused apprehensions of British imperialists. By early 1917, a new British cabinet was actively searching for ways and means for extricating itself from the agreements which its predecessor had reached with France for the post-war division of the spoils of war in the Arab domains of the Ottoman Empire. It was at that point that formerly abortive Zionist attempts to secure British support for a Zionist-dominated Palestine were reactivated at Britain's instigation. Reciprocal interests had thus come to bind British imperialism and Zionist colonialism. On the one hand, Britain, by utilizing Zionist influence in the United States and in France, would avert international rule in Palestine on the pretext that a British-sponsored program of Zionist colonization required British rule in Palestine. On the other hand, by playing a catalytic role in bringing about the designation of Britain as the ruling power in Palestine, Zionism would at last be able to embark upon the long-awaited program of large-scale colonization in the coveted territory under the auspices and protection of a great power. Britain would have the assurance that an embattled Zionist settler community would remain indefinitely dependent upon Britain's protection and would continue to require and justify British presence in Palestine, while, for its part, Zionism would also have the assurance that Britain, bound internationally by its wartime commitment to facilitate Zionist colonization, would provide the Zionist settler community with the protection it needed during the formative stages of its establishment against expected Arab opposition. The alliance of convenience and mutual need binding British imperialism and Zionist colonialism was complete. Preliminary Zionist efforts in Washington to secure America's approval were not unsuccessful, notwithstanding President Wilson's emphasis on the principle of self-determination, with which the Zionist colonization of Palestine, despite Arab opposition, would clash headlong. Nor were simultaneous Zionist efforts in Paris to secure French approval of the revision of earlier Anglo-French agreements on the future of Palestine entirely discouraging. With such preparatory work out of the way, Britain announced its policy statement of November 2nd, 1917, commonly known as the Balfour Declaration, proclaiming its support for the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. According to the plan, Zionists then requested the peace conference to confer the Palestine Mandate on Britain. Britain in turn incorporated its undertaking, first enunciated in the Balfour Declaration, in the text of the Palestine Mandate. The path was now clear for both British imperialism and Zionist colonialism to pursue jointly their respective objectives. Britain lost no time in creating the appropriate conditions for Zionist colonization. It appointed a Zionist Jew as its first High Commissioner in Palestine. It recognized the World Zionist Organization as a representative Jewish agency. It opened the gates of Palestine to massive Zionist immigration despite Arab protests. It transferred state lands to the Zionists for colonization. It protected the institutions of the fledgling national home. It permitted the Zionist community to run its own schools and to maintain its military establishment, the Haganah. It trained mobile Zionist striking force, the Palmach, and condoned the existence of the underground terrorist organizations, the Stern Group and the Airgun. No wonder that by the mid-30s, a British Royal Commission had come to describe the Zionist settler community in Palestine as a state within a state. In the meantime, the Arab majority, while constantly assured that Britain would see to it that its rights would not be prejudiced by the rapid growth of the Zionist settler community, was denied analogous facilities and deprived of the means for self-protection. After 30 years of British rule, the Zionist settler community grew to 12 times its size in 1917 and came to represent a little under one-third of the total population of Palestine. In the meantime, it had developed, under the auspices of the Mandatory Power, its own quasi-governmental institutions and a sizable military establishment. But Britain had not entered into the partnership with Zionism in Palestine solely in order to serve the purposes of Zionist colonialism. It had expected the partnership to serve equally the purposes of British imperialism as well. Whenever Zionism sought to accelerate the processes of state building, which would eventually render Britain's continued presence in Palestine neither necessary nor desirable in Zionist eyes, Britain pulled in the opposite direction to slow them down. The Second World War precipitated the showdown, which in the end brought about the dissolution of the Anglo-Zionist alliance. By the end of the Second World War, Britain's wartime enfeeblement and the imminent independence of India had led to a relative diminution of Britain's interest in the alliance, while the growing opposition of the newly emerging Arab states to Britain's role in Palestine had forced Britain to exercise some restraint in its formerly wholehearted support for the Zionist cause. On the other hand, the advent of the United States as an active world power with economic and strategic interests in the Middle East and the growing responsiveness of American politicians to the Zionist cause offered Zionism the prospects of an alternative Western sponsor for the new fateful phase of its capture of Palestine. In the mid-40s, therefore, Zionist colonization of Palestine, sheltered and nursed for 30 years by British imperialism, was ready to look for a more powerful and more militant supporter to see it through the forthcoming struggle for outright statehood. And the United States was available as a willing candidate that admirably fitted the requirements of Zionism. If the League of Nations was the instrument selected for bestowing upon the Anglo-Zionist partnership a semblance of international respectability, the United Nations was selected for a similar purpose by the American Zionist Entente. Britain had prevailed upon a predominantly European league to endorse a program of European Zionist colonization in Palestine. The United States led a European-American majority to overrule the opposition of an Afro-Asian minority in the General Assembly and to endorse the establishment of a colonial Zionist state in the Afro-Asian Bridge, the Arab land of Palestine. For, apart from the Union of South Africa, itself ruled by an alien settler minority, no Asian or African country spoke in favor of the partition plan proposed to the General Assembly by its Special Committee on Palestine, and, although in its final vote on November 29, 1947, one Asian and one African country, other than the Union of South Africa, did vote for the adoption of the recommendation, enthusiastic support for the proposal came exclusively from Europe, Australia, and the Western Hemisphere. An alien state was to be planted in the land link between Asia and Africa without the free consent of any neighboring African or Asian country. It was at that stage in the tragic history of Palestine that Palestinian Arabs, debilitated by 30 years of British suppression, proved incapable of withstanding the assault of the Zionist community, organized and trained and armed as it was and supported by the European-American international community of the day. The Arab people of Palestine lost not only the battle for the political control of its own country, it lost its country as well. Palestinians were forcibly expelled from their homeland, and their land, thus ruthlessly emptied of its rightful inhabitants, was opened for a well-organized and liberally financed new wave of colonization, speedily executed in order to create a seeming fait accompli, the reversal of which world public opinion would be reluctant to urge. The alliance of Zionist colonialism with one Western imperial power was momentarily dissolved after it had served its purpose, but it was simultaneously reincarnated in a new form to suit the New World circumstances and the new stage of Zionist colonialism. As one Western sponsor retreated to the background, other Western sponsors rushed to the foreground. Zionist colonialism made a tactical change of allies, but did not abandon the strategy of imperialist alliances as such. For, without the umbilical cord linking the Zionist settler community with its extra-regional sources of supply and power, it has and can have little ability of its own to survive. Even the alliance with British imperialism was dissolved only momentarily, for, when the time came for a revised British imperial strategy under altered world circumstances to seek fulfillment through a new alignment with Zionist colonialism, which was then aiming in its new status as a state at new objectives of territorial expansion, collusion between the old allies along with the Fourth French Republic was readily arranged. The 1956 invasion of Egypt promptly ensued. And when the collapse of the Fourth Republic in France and the chastening experience of Britain in Suez made it inexpedient for the Zionist settler state to continue to depend upon those two countries for the tools of further aggressiveness, Zionism appears to have found little difficulty in recruiting another European power to serve as a supplier of aggressive weapons. At the bidding of the United States, the Federal Republic of Germany rushed to fill the vacuum, supplementing massive economic aid, which a tormented German consciousness, cleverly manipulated by world Zionism, had prevailed upon the Federal Republic to extend to the Zionist settler state under the alias of reparations, with massive military gifts secretly agreed upon and stealthily given. But for all the means of survival it manages to acquire, now from one Western power and now from another, the Zionist settler state remains an alien body in the region. Not only its vital and continuing association with European imperialism and its introduction into Palestine of the practices of Western colonialism, but also its chosen pattern of racial exclusiveness and self-segregation renders it an alien society in the Middle East. No words could better describe the essentially alien character of the Zionist settler state than the following passage, written by its veteran prime minister. The State of Israel is a part of the Middle East only in geography, which is, in the main, a static element. From the decisive aspects of dynamism, creation, and growth, Israel is a part of world Jewry. From that Jewry, it will draw all its strength and the means for the forging of the nation in Israel and the development of the land. Through the might of world Jewry, it will be built again and again. 3. The character of the Zionist settler state. Apart from its vital link with imperialism and its inescapable status as a total stranger to the Middle East, in the heart of which it has chosen to plant itself, the political embodiment of Zionist colonialism, namely the Zionist settler state of Israel, is characterized chiefly by three features. 1. Its racial complexion and racist conduct pattern. 2. Its addiction to violence. And 3. Its expansionist stance. A. Racism. Racism is not an acquired trait of the Zionist settler state, nor is it an accidental passing feature of the Israeli scene. It is congenital, essential, and permanent. For it is inherent in the very ideology of Zionism and in the basic motivation for Zionist colonization and statehood. Zionism is the belief in the national oneness of all Jews, who are identified as such in terms of their supposed common ancestry. Neither religion nor language comprises the alleged national bond of Jews according to the Zionist creed. For relatively few Zionists are in fact believing or practicing Jews, and the Hebrew language was resuscitated only after the birth of Zionism. Recent legislation and precedent-making court decisions in the Zionist state, as well as the political literature of the Zionist movement since its inception, would appear to indicate that its ancestry, the sheer biological fact of descent from other Jews, that makes a person Jewish in Zionist eyes. Zionist racial identification produces three corollaries: racial self-segregation, racial exclusiveness, and racial supremacy. These principles constitute the core of the Zionist ideology. The primordial impulse for Zionist colonialism is the pursuit of national self-realization by the Jewish nation, by means of territorial regrouping and independent statehood. Racial self-segregation is therefore the quintessence of Zionism. By its very nature, racial self-segregation precludes integration or assimilation. From Herzl to Weizmann, from Ben-Gurion to Goldman, the leaders of Zionism have all believed and preached that the chief enemy of Zionism is not the Gentile anti-Semitism, but Jewish assimilation. Anti-Semitism and Zionism thus agree on the basic premise that all Jews are one nation, with common national characteristics and a common national destiny. The difference between them is that whereas anti-Semitism disdains the alleged national characteristics of Jews and delights in Jewish suffering, Zionism idealizes those fancied characteristics and strives to bring all Jews together into a single Jewish state, to which even moderate Zionists attribute a special mission. According to the Zionist creed, assimilation is the loss of Jewish identity. It is the prelude to the dissolution and the elimination of the Jewish nation. Self-segregation is the Zionist retort to the call for Jewish assimilation, for self-segregation is envisioned as the only pathway to national redemption, salvation, and fulfillment. By the same logic, by virtue of which it uncompromisingly repudiates the assimilation of Jews into non-Jewish societies, the fundamental Zionist principle of racial self-segregation also demands racial purity and racial exclusiveness in the land in which Jewish self-segregation is to be attained. As such, the Zionist credo of racial self-segregation necessarily rejects the coexistence of Jews and non-Jews in the land of Jewish regrouping. Coexistence with non-Jewish communities, including the indigenous inhabitants, in the territory in which Jews are to be assembled, is as much of a blemish on the image of pure Zionist racism as is continued Jewish residence in the land of the Gentiles, i.e., the lands of so-called Jewish exile. The Zionist ideal of racial self-segregation demands with equal imperativeness the departure of all Jews from the lands of their exile and the eviction of all non-Jews from the land of Jewish destination, namely Palestine. Both are essential conditions of Zionist fulfillment and Jewish national redemption. It is only in such a condition of thoroughgoing self-segregation that Jewish superiority can at last manifest itself according to the teachings of Zionism. The chosen people can attain its special destiny only when it is all together and all by itself. Herein lies an important difference between Zionist racism and other forms of European racism familiar since the advent of colonialism to the peoples of Asia and Africa. Race supremacist European settlers elsewhere in Asia and Africa have, by and large, found it possible to express their supremacy over the other strands of lesser peoples and inferior races within the framework of hierarchical racial coexistence. Separate and unequal, the European colonists and the natives have on the whole coexisted in the same colony or protectorate. Though they have openly disdained the natives, ruthlessly suppressed them, and methodically discriminated against them, European colonists have, as a rule, deemed the continued presence of the indigenous populations useful for the colonists themselves. And as such, they have reserved for the natives all the menial functions and assigned to them inferior roles in the settler-dominated societies. Not so the Zionists. Race supremacist Zionist settlers in Palestine have found it necessary to follow a different course, more in harmony with their ideological system. They have expressed their fancied supremacy over the Arab natives first by isolating themselves from the Arabs in Palestine and, later on, by evicting the Arabs from their homeland. Nowhere in Asia or Africa, not even in South Africa or Rhodesia, has European race supremacism expressed itself in so passionate a zeal for the thoroughgoing racial exclusiveness and for physical expulsion of the native populations across the frontiers of the settler state as it has in Palestine under the compulsion of Zionist doctrines. Perhaps this divergence of Zionism from the norm of European colonization may be explained in terms of the fact that conscious dedication to the racist doctrines inherent in the ideology of Zionism has preceded stimulated, inspired, and at every stage guided the process of Zionist colonization in Palestine, at least since the inauguration of the new Zionist movement in 1897. So long as they were powerless to dislodge the indigenous Arabs of Palestine, the vast majority of the country's population, Zionist colonists were content with isolating themselves from the Arab community and instituting a systematic boycott of Arab produce and labor. Accordingly, from the earliest days of Zionist colonization, the principle was established that only Jewish labor would be employed in Zionist colonies. The Jewish Agency, the Jewish National Fund, the Palestine Foundation Fund, and the Jewish Federation of Labor vigilantly ensured the observance of that fundamental principle of Zionist colonization. Contentment with boycotting the Arabs of Palestine instead of evicting them from their country was, however, only a tactical and temporary suspension of the Zionist dogma of racial exclusiveness. It was forced upon Zionism by the circumstances surrounding the early stages of Zionist colonization, and it was viewed as a necessary evil to be endured only so long as a more rigorous application of the racist doctrines of Zionism was prevented by extraneous factors beyond the control of the Zionist movement. The ultimate aim of ousting the Arab inhabitants of Palestine in order to make possible the incarnation of the principle of racial exclusiveness, though momentarily suspended, was never abandoned, however. As early as 1895, Herzl was busy devising a plan to spirit the penniless population across the frontier by denying it employment. And in 1919, Weizmann was forecasting the creation of a Palestine that would be as Jewish as England is English, and defining the Zionist program in terms of building a nationality which would be as Jewish as the French nation was French and the British nation was British. Thus, although it was not until 1948 that the Zionist aim was at last fulfilled, through the forcible expulsion of the majority of the Palestinian Arabs from their homeland, the objective of de-Arabizing Palestine as a requirement of Zionizing that country had been entertained by the Zionist movement since its inception. The Zionist concept of the final solution to the Arab problem in Palestine and the Nazi concept of the final solution to the Jewish problem in Germany consisted essentially of the same basic ingredient: the elimination of the unwanted human element in question. The creation of a Jew-free Germany was indeed sought by Nazism through more ruthless and more inhumane methods than was the creation of an Arab-free Palestine accomplished by the Zionists, but behind the difference in techniques lay an identity of goals. If racial discrimination against the inferior natives was the motto of race supremacist European settler regimes in Asia and Africa, the motto of the race supremacist Zionist settler regime in Palestine was racial elimination. Discriminatory treatment has been reserved by the Zionists for those remnants of the Palestinian Arab people who have stubbornly stayed behind in their homeland, in spite of all the efforts to dispossess and evict them, and in defiance of the Zionist dictum of racial exclusiveness. It is against these remnants of the rightful inhabitants of Palestine that Zionist settlers have revealed the behavioral patterns of racial supremacy and practiced the precepts of racial discrimination already made famous by other racist European colonists elsewhere in Asia and Africa. In fact, in its practices of racial discrimination against these vestiges of Palestinian Arabs, the Zionist settler state has learned all the lessons which the various discriminatory regimes of white settler states in Asia and Africa can teach it. And it has proved itself in this endeavor an ardent and apt pupil, not incapable of surpassing its teachers. For, Whereas the Afrikaner apostles of apartheid in South Africa, for example, brazenly proclaim their sin, the Zionist practitioners of apartheid in Palestine begulingly protest their innocence. The remnants of Palestine's Arabs who have continued to live in the Zionist settler state since 1948 have their own Bantustans, their native reserves, their ghettos. Although the institution which they encounter in their daily lives is given by the Zionist authorities the euphemistic name security zone. About 90% of Arabs living under Israel's jurisdiction live in such security zones. Alone in the Zionist settler state, these Arabs live under martial law, whereas in other parts of the country, civil administration prevails. In the Arab-inhabited security zones, the administrative functionaries are military officers serving under the Ministry of Defense. Arabs charged with offenses under the martial law in force in the security zones, the emergency defense regulations, are prosecuted before military tribunals, the decisions of which are not appealable. Deportation and forced residence by fiat of the military governor are commonplace. Alone in the Zionist settler state, Arab inhabitants of the security zones are subject to the pass system, which harshly restricts their movement and travel. Alone in the Zionist settler state, Arabs are denied the basic rights of expression, assembly, and association. They are not permitted to publish newspapers or to form political organizations. Educational opportunities for Arabs are severely restricted. The higher the level of education, the more discriminatory the restriction of opportunities. Nor is the quality of the educational system to which Arabs have disproportionately limited access faintly comparable to the education system open to Jews. Economically, Arabs in the Zionist settler state suffer from threefold handicap. Their limited access to employment opportunities creates large-scale unemployment. Such employment as they are permitted to obtain is confined largely to menial services, and they are denied the right to equal pay for equal work. The agricultural lands and homes of the Arabs in the Zionist settler state are subject to confiscation by administrative decree under a succession of drastic laws introduced by the state between 1948 and 1953, which deny aggrieved owners the ability to seek redress through the courts. Whole Arab villages have been expropriated and given to Jews for the establishment of Zionist settlements. Arab participation in the administration of the Zionist settler state on any level of meaningful responsibility is virtually unknown. In most government departments, Arab participation on any level is completely non-existent. Even in the government office charged with Arab affairs, no Arab is employed. Finally, the enjoyment by Arabs of their own elementary right to citizenship in their own country is curtailed by natatory discrimination. Whereas a Jew under the nationality law is eligible for citizenship immediately upon arrival, indigenous Arabs of the Zionist settler state are subject to a system of qualified eligibility which has left a majority of Israel's Arabs languishing in limbo of non-citizenship. B. Violence and terrorism. Habitual resort to force by the military or paramilitary arms of the Zionist settler state has been directed principally against the Arabs, whose very existence in the land coveted by the Zionists rendered them automatically the primary and the ultimate target of Zionist hostility. But this addiction to violence has not been totally confined in its manifestations to Zionist relations with the Arabs. Towards the end of the British Mandate, when the alliance of British imperialism and Zionist colonialism, having served its purpose, was beginning to undergo the strains which finally led to its dissolution, the paramilitary and terrorist Zionist organizations, which Britain had respectively aided and condoned for decades, turned against the British garrison and British civil authorities in Palestine. And after the outbreak of Zionist Arab hostilities in Palestine and the advent of United Nations mediators and truce observers, Zionist violence turned against the international personnel also. The assassination of the first United Nations mediator and his military aide, and the occasional detention of United Nations observers have served notice that no one who stands athwart the path of Zionism is immune from Zionist vengeance. But obviously, it is against the Arabs that Zionist violence has been most long-lasting, most methodical, and most ruthless. Prenatally and at birth, the Zionist settler state resorted to violence as its chosen means of intimidating the Arabs of Palestine and evicting them. Such massacres as those which were perpetrated at Deir Yassin, Ain Zaytun, and Salah ad-Din in April 1948 were calculated measures in a formal program of eviction by terrorization. Since its establishment, the Zionist settler state has turned its violence both inwardly and outwardly against the Arabs remaining under its jurisdiction and against the neighboring Arab states. In the Zionist-occupied territories of Palestine, massacres and other outrages visited upon such Arab towns and villages, such as Ikrth in December of 1951, El Tirah of July 1953, Abu Ghosh, September 1953, Kafr Qasim, October 1956, and Akir, June 1965, have been the most infamous, but by no means the only, instances of a program of racial hate elevated to the level of state policy and efficiently executed by the official apparatus of the state. To these instances must be added the large-scale pogroms unleashed on the Arab population of Gaza and Khan Yunis during the brief but eventful period of the Zionist occupation of the area in the wake of the tripartite invasion of Egypt in 1956. Systematic military attacks on the territories of neighboring Arab states are perhaps the most widely known manifestations of Israel's ready resort to violence. For many of these attacks were fully discussed by the United Nations Security Council. In addition to the full-scale war launched jointly by Zionist colonialism and British and French imperialism against Egypt in 1956, and deplored by the General Assembly in 6 resolutions, and adopted between November 2, 1956 and February 2, 1957, smaller-scale attacks on Hama, April 1951, Gibeah, October 1953, Gaza, February 1955, and across Lake Tiberias, December 1955 and March 1962, were duly condemned by the Security Council on May 18, 1951, November 24, 1953, March 29, 1955, January 19, 1956, and April 9, 1962, respectively. Other attacks, too numerous to cite individually, have elicited similar condemnations from the competent mixed armistice commissions. C. Territorial expansion. No student of the behavioral pattern of the Zionist movement and the modus operandi of the Zionist settler state can fail to realize that Zionist attainments at any given moment if they fall short of the standing objective constantly aimed at by the Zionist movement, are only temporary stations along the road to ultimate self-fulfillment and not terminal points of the Zionist journey, notwithstanding the assurances to the contrary which are solemnly given by Zionist and Israeli leaders. For example, although from 1897 until 1942 the official leaders of Zionism constantly denied in public any intention of seeking statehood, emphasizing it was merely a home they were after, the internal documents of the movement and the diaries of its leaders clearly indicate that, notwithstanding public disavowals, it was indeed statehood that was the objective of Zionism all along. The goal of establishing a Zionist state, first admitted openly in 1942, was attained 6 years later. Similarly, until 1948, the leaders of Zionism were constantly assuring the world that they harbored no intention of dispossessing or evicting the Arabs of Palestine from their homeland, although evidence abounds that, in fact, they were aiming at nothing less than the thorough Zionization and de-Arabization of Palestine from the very beginning. And when the opportunity arose in 1948, Zionists wasted no time in pushing the Arabs across the frontiers. In these two vital matters, the true aim of Zionism had been well known to all students and close observers of the movement. The Zionist stratagem of public disavowal was merely a smokescreen designed to conceal the true and unchanging objectives in order to gain time for preparing the ground for the right move at the right moment. Territorial extent is a third element of the Zionist plan, regarding which the same stratagem of deceptive public disavowal has been utilized. It differs from the other two elements, statehood and eviction of the Arabs, only in that whereas these two aims have been realized and the camouflage has been finally removed, the third aim, territorial expansion, remains only partly realized, and the veil remains only partially lifted. The perennial aim of Zionism was and still is statehood in all of Palestine, called by Zionists Eretz Israel, or Land of Israel, completely emptied of its Arabs. The minimum definition of the territorial scope of Palestine, as Zionism envisions it, was officially formulated in 1919, and it covers about double the area currently occupied by the Zionist settler state. It includes, in present geographical terminology, the Kingdom of Jordan on both sides of the river, the Gaza Strip, southern Lebanon, and southern and southwestern Syria, as well as the portions of Palestine now occupied by the Zionists. This area still falls short of the territory bounded in accordance with the famous biblical phrase, by the Nile and the Euphrates, which is the territory claimed as the national heritage by Zionist extremists. But even if only the minimum Zionist concept of Palestine is taken to be the real basis of Zionist planning, that will leave the road towards Zionist territorial expansion in the future wide open. For no more than one half of this coveted area is now under the control of the Zionist settler state. Twice since its establishment has the Zionist settler state demonstrated the fact that, as far as territorial scope was concerned, it was following the same modus operandi which the Zionist movement had followed so successfully in the preceding 50 years with respect to statehood and the evictions of Arabs. 1. In 1948 and early 1949, it occupied areas not earmarked for the Jewish state in the General Assembly recommendation for the partition of Palestine. Only a few months after the Zionist organization had assured the Assembly that it was content with the territories given to the proposed Jewish state. And 2. In late October and early November 1956, taking advantage of the preoccupation of the Egyptian armed forces with the defense of Egypt against the invading forces of Britain and France, the Zionist partner in the aggressive tripartite conspiracy found it possible to occupy the Gaza Strip and parts of the Sinai Peninsula. For 4 months thereafter, the Zionist state rejected repeated United Nations demands for the immediate withdrawal, pleading that the annexed Palestinian and Egyptian territories were part of the Zionist historical homeland and national heritage. Not only by ominous deeds, but also by ominous words has the Zionist settler state given indication of its intention, when the time was propitious, to grab new territories lying within the boundaries of what it claims as its national patrimony. The veteran premier of the Zionist state, David Ben-Gurion, on at least 2 occasions has solemnly announced in 2 official state documents that the state was created in a part of our small country and only in a portion of the land of Israel. And the state itself has proclaimed that the creation of the new state by no means derogates from the scope of historic Eretz Israel. In view of the consistent behavioral pattern of the Zionist movement, in view also of the traditional Zionist concept of the territorial extent of Eretz Israel, of which even the moderate version comprises an area twice as large as the one usurped thus far by Zionist state, and in view of the clear warnings voiced by the most candid and authoritative leaders of Zionism to the effect that the Zionist state has not abandoned its determination to seize new Arab territories. In view of all this, it would be absurd to believe ostrich-wise that Zionism might indefinitely rest, content with possessing only a fraction of the territory which it maintains is its national heritage, and which, in any case, it has planned all along to occupy. Of the 3 essential elements of the Zionist program, racial self-segregation in a Zionist state, racial exclusiveness and eviction of Arabs, and occupation of all of so-called Eretz Israel, only the third remains unrealized. It is the unfinished business of Zionism. It cannot fail to be the main preoccupation of the Zionist movement and of the Zionist state in the future. For the Zionist settler state, to be is to prepare and strive for territorial expansion. 4. The Palestinians' response, from resistance to liberation. The response of the people of Palestine to the menace of Zionism has passed through 5 stages. 1. At the outset, when Zionists were coming in relatively small numbers and emphasizing the religious or humanitarian motives of their enterprise while concealing the political, ideological, and colonial racist character of their movement, the Arabs of Palestine believed the immigrants to be pilgrims, animated by religious longing for the Holy Land, or else refugees fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe and seeking safety in Palestine. Palestinian Arabs therefore accorded the immigrants a hospitable welcome. Even Herzl noted the friendly attitude of the population to the first wave of Zionist colonists. 2. When after the inauguration of the new Zionist movement in 1897, the second wave of Zionist colonization began to roll onto the shores of Palestine from 1907 to 1908 onwards. Arab friendliness began to give way to suspicion and resentment. The methodical ouster of Arab farmers, laborers, and watchmen from the new Zionist colonies and the systematic boycott of Arab produce aroused Arab anger. But the larger political nationalist dimensions of the Zionist program remained concealed from Arab sight. It was the immediate impact of the Zionists' presence upon the Arabs directly affected by the Zionists' race exclusivist and race supremacist practices that was causing Arab wrath. Inasmuch as Zionist colonization was still of modest proportions, however, the hostility it provoked remained more or less local. 3. The alliance of British imperialism and Zionist colonialism, concretely expressed in the Balfour Declaration of November 2, 1917, and the British capture of Jerusalem on December 9, 1917, at last opened Arab eyes to the true significance of what was happening and brought home the realization that nothing less than the dislodgement was in store for the Arabs if Zionism was to be permitted to have its way. Palestinian masses instinctively recognized the events of the day as an occurrence of dire portent, and for 30 years thereafter, Palestine was to be the scene of persistent and tireless Arab resistance to the Anglo-Zionist partnership. That period from 1917 to 1948 was the period of Arab resistance par excellence. The disquiet which followed the publication of the Balfour Declaration was momentarily calmed, however, by British assurances made in 1918. An official declaration by the British government issued on June 16, 1918, assured the Arabs that as far as the territories occupied by the Allied armies were concerned, the future government of those territories should be based on the principle of the constant of the governed. This policy will always be that of His Majesty's government. And only 4 days before the armistice, a widely publicized joint Anglo-French declaration issued on November 7, 1918, notified the Arabs of Syria, Iraq, and Palestine that it was the intention of the two allies to further and assist in the setting up of indigenous governments and to recognize them as soon as they are actually set up. These declarations, though they soon proved to be insincere and dishonest, served in the meantime to allay the fears of the people of Palestine. As 1919 opened, all eyes were on Paris. The peace conference was hopefully expected to resolve the contradictions of Allied wartime promises and to inaugurate the long-awaited new era of world history, founded on the principle of national self-determination, of which President Wilson had made emphatic enunciation. But as those hopes dwindled and the influx of Zionist colonists, interrupted during the war, was resumed, Arab fears were revived, and so was Arab resistance to the twin dangers of protracted British occupation and expanded Zionist colonization. Palestinian Arab opposition to the Anglo-Zionist partnership was first expressed in 1919 in diplomatic representations and in collective declarations of the general will of the people. The American King Crane Commission was left in no doubt about the true feelings of the people of Palestine. On August 29, 1919, the commission reported that the non-Jewish population of Palestine, nearly 9/10 of the whole, are emphatically against the entire Zionist program. There was no one thing upon which the population of Palestine was more agreed than upon this. The findings of the commission corroborated the decisions of the General Syrian Congress, consisting of elected representatives of the populations of Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. A resolution passed unanimously by the Congress on July 2nd of 1919 announced, "We oppose the pretensions of the Zionists to create a Jewish commonwealth in the southern part of Syria known as Palestine, and oppose Zionist migration to any part of our country, for we do not acknowledge their title but consider them a grave peril to our people from the national, economical, and political points of view. Our Jewish compatriots shall enjoy our common rights and assume the common responsibilities." Similar utterances of unqualified rejection of Zionism continue to be made by every Palestinian Arab gathering throughout the decades of British occupation of Palestine. Not once did a Palestinian Arab group or conference express acceptance, even partial or qualified, of Zionist colonization. And the feeling so unequivocally expressed to the King Crane Commission in 1919 continued thereafter to be expressed with equal forcefulness to the mandatory government and its countless commissions, as well as to the League of Nations and the United Nations, by every Palestinian delegation that had a chance to appear before any of those bodies. But declarations of opposition, however important as an expression of national will, were not the only means of resistance to which the people of Palestine had recourse. In March 1920, armed hostilities broke out between Arab villagers and Zionist colonists in northern Palestine, and in April 1920, Arab Zionist fighting took place in Jerusalem. These were followed by uprisings in 1921, 1929, and 1933, and by a countrywide rebellion in 1936, which was renewed in 1937 and lasted until the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. And from December 1947 until the withdrawal of Britain and the simultaneous proclamation of the Zionist settler state in May 1948, Palestinian Arabs were engaged in a life and death battle with the British garrison as well as with Zionist colonists. By their untiring reiteration of their rejection of Zionist colonialism and by their unstinting sacrifice of life and limb in defense of the sanctity of the homeland over 30 years, Palestinians of all walks of life eloquently testified, by word as well as deed, in ink as well as blood, to their devotion to their national rights and their unqualified opposition to the Zionization of their country. The range of means by which Palestinians chose to express their opposition to the partnership of Zionist colonialism and British imperialism from 1917 to 1948 was not confined to declaration and rebellion. In more prosaic and perhaps more difficult and more costly methods, the unqualified no of the Arabs of Palestine was addressed to empire builders and to racist colonists alike. At the height of the famous rebellion of 1936, the people of Palestine launched a devastating civil disobedience movement coupled with a countrywide strike, which lasted for 174 days, perhaps the longest national strike in history, and affected all businesses, communications, and government services run by Arabs. In spite of its high cost to themselves, the men and women of Palestine persisted in their strike, resisting all efforts of the mandatory power to break it, and did not call it off until the rulers of the neighboring Arab states intervened and promised to initiate collective Arab negotiations with the British government, with a view to remedying the causes of Palestinian Arab grievances. More importantly, the Palestinian Arabs brought into their struggle against the Zionization of Palestine the only remaining weapon at their command. If they had no control over the immigration of Zionist colonists into Palestine, they did have some control over the sale of land to those colonists. This weapon they used unsparingly throughout the period of the Mandate. The record shows that during 30 years of British occupation and active encouragement of Zionist colonization, while the Zionists were allowed by the mandatory power to multiply to 12 times their number in 1917, and while the ratio of the Zionists to the total population was allowed to rise to 1/3, Zionist acquisition of land grew at a snail's pace as a result of the Arabs' refusal to sell their land to the colonists. Statistics published by the British government reveal that the total area acquired by Zionists from 1920, when land registries were opened, until the dislodgement of the Arabs was under 4% of the total area of Palestine. Of this Zionist-acquired land, a part was sold by non-Palestinian absentee landowners, and another part was transferred to the Zionist colonization funds by the British government itself, public domain over which the mandatory government was trustee for the Palestinian people. In fact, an official spokesman for the Jewish agency disclosed to a British commission that, of the land purchased by the Jews, relatively small areas not exceeding in all 10% were acquired from peasants. 4. In 1948, the Palestinian Arab people was forcefully dispossessed. Most Palestinians were evicted from their country. Their unyielding resistance and their costly sacrifices over 3 decades had failed to avert the national catastrophe. But those sacrifices were not in vain, for they safeguarded the Palestinian national rights and underscored the legitimacy of the Arabs' claim to their national heritage. Rights undefended are rights surrendered. Unopposed and equestrian usurpation is legitimized by default. For forfeiture of its patrimony, the Palestinian generation of the interwar era will never be indicted by the Palestinian generations to come. It lost indeed, but not without fighting. It was dislodged indeed, but not for want of the will to defend its heritage. Nor has the people of Palestine retroactively bestowed undeserved legitimacy upon the Zionist colonization of Palestine by recognizing the fait accompli after the fact. Many have been self-appointed counselors of realism, urging upon Palestinians acknowledgement of the new status quo in Palestine and acceptance of their exile in good grace. And many have been lucrative offers of economic aid for resettlement and rehabilitation outside Palestine. But the people, which had remained for 30 years undaunted by the combined power of British imperialism and Zionist colonialism, and which subsequently refused to allow its seizure of the land and the dispersal of its body to conquer its soul also, knew very well how to resist those siren calls. The Zionist settler state, therefore, has remained a usurper, lacking even the semblance of legitimacy because the people of Palestine has remained loyal to its heritage and faithful to its rights. 5. The people of Palestine, notwithstanding all its travails and misfortunes, still has undiminished faith in its future. And the people of Palestine knows that the pathway to that future is the liberation of its homeland. It was in this belief that the Palestinian people, after 16 years of dispersion and exile, during which it had reposed its faith in its return to its country and world conscience and international public opinion in the United Nations and/or in the Arab states, chose at last to seize the initiative. In 1964, it reasserted its corporate personality by creating the Palestine Liberation Organization. Only in the liberation of Palestine, spearheaded by Palestinians prepared to pay the price, can the supreme sacrifices of past generations of Palestinians be vindicated, and the visions and hopes of living Palestinians be transformed into reality. Epilogue: The liberation of Palestine. The right to national liberation is an extension of the right to national self-defense, which the Charter of the United Nations not only upholds, but also declares to be inherent and beyond impairment by the provisions of the Charter itself. If continued acquisition of the fruits of an attack is tantamount to continuation of the attack itself, the liberation of territory seized by aggression is an extension of the inherent right to resist the original aggression. Liberation and self-defense are two facets of the same inalienable right. The right to national liberation has come to be all but universally recognized. Only die-hard imperial and colonial regimes still invoke the mythical principle of the inviolability of dominion acquired by past and continuing aggression, in the hope that they might arrest the process of decolonization before the rising tide of national liberation engulfs their anachronistic regimes. Exercise of the right to national liberation is not confined to situations in which alien domination subjects a people to the control of another, or in which the resources of one people are selfishly exploited by another. Exercise of the right to national liberation extends also, and in greater justice, to those situations in which the land of one people was subjected to the control of another while it was forcibly emptied of its rightful inhabitants. The tragic fate of Palestine subsumes all these elements of foreign domination, exploitation, and dispossession, and others besides. The territory of Palestine is under alien rule. Its resources are exploited by others. Its people are exiles from their homeland. The remnants of its Arab inhabitants languish under a regime of racist discrimination and oppression as harsh as any race supremacist regime in Asia or Africa. All this has been accomplished by connivance with imperialism and by terror and violence, and no aspect of this multifaceted fait accompli has been legitimized, whether by commission or by omission, by the people of Palestine or any fraction thereof. In its determination to pursue the difficult path of national liberation, the people of Palestine are encouraged by the faith in the justice of its cause repeatedly expressed by newly liberated peoples in successive international conferences. From Bandung to Accra, from Casablanca to Belgrade, that faith in the justice of the cause of the Palestinian Arabs has been clearly expressed. And at the second conference of the heads of state or government of non-aligned countries, full support to the Arab people of Palestine in their struggle for liberation from colonialism and racism was solemnly declared. The supreme leaders of the peoples who still retain vivid memories of their recent experiences under imperialism, colonialism, and/or racism have thus evinced responsiveness to the pains and hopes of the Palestinian people, still suffering from all these evils, and from dispossession and dispersion as well. Such responsiveness cannot fail to augment the profound faith of the Palestinians in the ultimate triumph of justice, liberty, and human dignity in their land. The problem of Palestine, although it directly afflicts only Palestinians, is not the concern of Palestinians alone. The Zionist settler state bent on expansion is a threat to the security and territorial integrity of the Arab states as well. It has already invaded their lands. It still covets their territories. As a colonial venture which animalously came to bloom precisely when colonialism was beginning to fade away, it is in fact a challenge to all anti-colonial peoples in Asia and Africa, for in the final analysis, the cause of anti-colonialism and liberation is one and indivisible. And, as a racist system animated by doctrines of racial self-segregation, racial exclusiveness, and racial supremacy, and methodologically translating these doctrines into ruthless practices of racial discrimination and oppression, the political systems erected by Zionist colonists in Palestine cannot fail to be recognized as a menace by all civilized men dedicated to the safeguarding and enhancement of the dignity of man. For whenever and wherever the dignity of but one single human is being violated in pursuance of the creed of racism, a heinous sin is committed against the dignity of all men everywhere. And that's the end of the text. Thank y'all for listening. I hope you enjoyed and learned something interesting and radicalizing. It's always super cool to hear y'all's perspectives, so feel free to leave a comment letting me know what you thought, even if you disagreed with the text. Be sure to check out my other videos and like, subscribe, and share. Again, thank you so much for being here, and until next time, love and solidarity from the South.